Chapter 22, The Snoop, Hanyu's POV. Hanyu was dreadfully bored. He'd done all the cleaning he could think of, but in the end, Lord Antony's quarters consisted of one moderately sized room, two small ones, and some assorted closets. They were hardly chambers befitting a lord of the gods, though he supposed that even a ship as large as this one did not allow for palatial quarters. The trouble was that, given the lack of space and objects, there wasn't nearly enough for him to do. He'd been told not to wait up, but he wasn't tired. He wished Lord Antony would come back so he had someone to talk to. He wondered about going out to speak with the rest of his cadre, but that was against his master's rules, and, to his shame, rather more convincingly, he didn't know where the offerings were being kept, so he was likely to wander around fruitlessly and eventually get caught. He drifted into the god's bedchamber. After all, he was allowed to sleep here, so surely he was allowed to have a look around. He hadn't properly explored in all his time here. He looked at Antony's immaculately made bed. The god did it himself every evening. Hanyu was glad of this, since he didn't think he'd be able to draw the sheets so tightly, eliminating even the smallest wrinkle. Antony's musical instruments were secured in small leather slings tacked to the underside of the bed. Hanyu wished he could see to discern whether there was anything else under the bed, but the torchlight offered no such view, casting the area into blackness. Hanyu crouched beside Antony's bookshelf and surveyed the neat row of spines, which were secured behind thick leather straps. Some were titled in his own language, some in a looping, elegant alphabet he didn't recognize. He wondered whether he would be allowed to read aloud to the god from some of the familiar volumes. He'd always been praised for his expressive reading. It would make him feel a little better after the abject failure that had been his musical performance. Antony's closet was much more promising. The god didn't have as many clothes as Hanyu would have expected, but there were two large chests bolted to the closet floor. Hanyu knelt in front of the first and tried the lid. It wasn't locked, opening with only the slightest creak of old wood. This was beginning to feel less like exploring and more like snooping, but the lure of the shadowy contents were too powerful for Hanyu to stop now. Who knew what he might be able to learn about his master? The torchlight didn't reach the closet floor, so Hanyu went to his own little closet to fetch a taper with a holder and light it. When he returned to the god's closet, the little candle illuminated the contents of the chest. At the top of the pile, there was a handful of papers, maps and coordinates. Hanyu realized on closer inspection. They didn't look anything like the maps he had seen back in the temple. On those maps, his homeland had been the only land, surrounded on all sides by a vaguely defined ocean. These maps showed multiple green masses that he could only assume were other islands. The thought set his heart pounding wildly. He had been so excited to venture over the ocean on the god's ship. He'd hoped to see a monster. But what if there were half a dozen other places to visit? Would there be monsters in those places? Or people? Or both? The gods didn't take offerings from anywhere else. At least he didn't think so. And he would have met one by now, wouldn't he? Was his homeland the only place with human people? Or were they simply the only ones worthy of attending the gods? Pride swelled in him along with his burgeoning curiosity. If there were people in those places, what would they be like? What would they eat and wear and sing and do? How would they talk? Maybe they were the ones who spoke the strange language in Antony's books. Maybe the people in those places all lived underground like voles, or in trees like birds. Maybe they didn't need food and lived from water and earth like plants. Maybe their babies grew from seeds. Maybe they rode giant cats or giant birds or flew all by themselves. Maybe they could scale walls like a lizard. The possibilities were truly endless, but they all faded into one burning question. Would Lord Antony take him there if he begged hard and behaved himself? He shouldn't ask. A good slave didn't make demands, a good offering even less so. But he'd never been a very good offering, and his master didn't seem to mind, even if Hanyu knew he was going to ask, again and again and again, more than he'd ever wanted anything, or even than he craved his god's touch. He longed to see those unimaginable places. Now that he knew they were there, he would never stop pleading and bargaining until he was allowed to visit every strangely shaped mass on these maps. Hanyu set the papers reverently aside and dug eagerly to see what other wonders Antony's trunk contained. There were more papers, some covered in that same looping alphabet. Was it just one, or were there multiple alphabets, and Hanyu simply hadn't seen enough of them to tell them apart? And then a pile of very old books, tightly bound in a waterproof oilskin. These were written in Hanyu's own language, and as he paged carefully through them, he was surprised to see that they were full of diagrams of bodies. Bones and muscles were sketched out in such detail that Hanyu found himself glancing down at his own body, wondering if it could really have such strange things inside of it. All of the books seemed to be medical texts, and though Hanyu had flipped through such volumes back in the temple, they had never much intrigued him. He certainly couldn't focus on them when his mind was still alight with thoughts of unimaginable countries to visit. He rewrapped them carefully, then replaced everything in the chest exactly as he'd found it. His desire to not be caught made it clear to him that this was indeed snooping. He wouldn't worry about Lord Antony finding out what he'd done if it wasn't something to be ashamed of. Still, he couldn't resist lifting his candle again and reaching for the other chest. This one was also unlocked, though the inside held a large metal box that Hanyu had to strain with both hands to open. It was lined with oilskin. Clearly, this box was meant to protect its contents even at the bottom of the sea. At the top of the box, he found a little satchel that spilled 2 rings into his palm. One was a plain silver band, but the other was heavy and seemed to be made of gold. When he examined the impressive ring more closely, he saw that it had a flat face engraved with an elaborate sigil. Perhaps it was a signet ring, like the ones the king and high priest used to seal their letters to the temple. Next came 4 portraits carefully wrapped in silk. The first was of a woman with the tapered ears of a god, but she looked older than any god Hanyu had ever seen. Her skin was as dark as Antony's, and her eyes were kind. She was dressed in fine, outlandish clothes, and wore jewels at her throat and ears. She was sitting at a low bench on a sun-drenched garden, strange bright flowers tumbling out of a bush behind her. Clearly, this was no night god. Who could she be? Next portrait was even stranger. It depicted a young human man with soft eyes and a shy smile. His clothes were not as elegant as the woman's, but he wore jewels in his ears as fine as a king could afford. There was a crown of flowers on his head, and he seemed to be in the same sunny garden. The third portrait was also of a human, but he looked like he could have come from Hanyu's own homeland. He was completely unlike either of the others. For one thing, he seemed to have been painted indoors by torchlight. For another, he wore a robe, where the others had been clad in shirt and trousers. This young man's smile was mischievous, his eyes clever and laughing, and he was leaning back on a fine, old-fashioned chair with his arms crossed jauntily behind his head, showing off lean muscles and a set of feeding scars on his neck. Hanyu's fingers crept up to brush the matching wounds on his own neck. Had this boy been an offering like him? Had he belonged to Lord Antony? How many hundreds of years ago had he served the god? Judging by his clothes, if he had truly come from Taisha, it would have been at least 500 or 600. Probably more, but Hanyu wasn't terribly interested in the history of fashion. Taiki might know. Hanyu felt sure that Antony had painted all 3 of these portraits. They looked like the ones the god had been painting of him. He felt equally sure that, unlike those pictures, these had not been painted to pass the time. He set them gently aside to open the final, carefully wrapped picture, but when he pulled aside the swath of fabric, he could see right away that this one was different. More precisely, it was terrible. It had no background to speak of, only an undifferentiated coat of pale green paint and a lopsided figure that Hanyu was fairly sure was supposed to be a person. After a few moments of squinting at the dark skin and white stick that he thought might be intended to represent a braid, he concluded that it was supposed to be Antony. There were 2 gray blobs that were probably eyes, and a wavery reddish line that might have been a mouth bracketing what could have been either a nose or a small dark potato. Had this been one of the god's first efforts at painting, maybe his very first, or had it been painted by someone else? Hanyu wished he knew, but either way, he found his chest squeezing and his eyes brimming a little to think of his master carefully wrapping and preserving such a monstrosity. It could only have been done out of love or deep nostalgia. Finally, Hanyu seemed to have reached the end of the portraits. Next thing he extracted was a thick packet of folded papers, probably letters, wrapped in oilskin and bound with leather straps. Hanyu reached automatically for the straps, then hesitated. He knew that all of this was terribly invasive, but reading Antony's letters was surely crossing a line. These had been preserved for untold centuries, and whatever was written on them must have been so important to his god that reading them would be as intimate as staring right into his heart. This would be a terrible thing to do without permission. But a peek into Antony's heart was exactly what he wanted. Hanyu hated himself as he undid the straps. He was afraid he would never forget the sight of his fingers unfolding the ancient, fragile paper of the first letter. The yellowed page was covered in that mysterious looping alphabet. Hanyu felt almost relieved as he gently smoothed the letter back into its accustomed fold and redid the straps. He wished it had been his own moral fiber that had stopped him instead of an unfamiliar language. His earlier excitement had been tamped down and replaced with self-loathing. A sow would never do something like this. Perfect Edgy probably hadn't touched these chests for more than dusting in his whole 6 years of serving the god. Hanyu was worse than useless. He was an actively terrible offering. Still, he couldn't help reaching for the final item in the trunk. It was stiff against his fingers. What he pulled out was a length of faded red fabric that, when he stood up and unfolded it, seemed to be some kind of robe. It was covered in gold stitchery and had hundreds of jewels embroidered onto its elaborate pattern, and it must once have been far grander than anything the Taishan's king's wardrobe could boast. Now, though, it was so old and fragile that it started crumbling in Hanyu's hands, ancient stitches giving way beneath his fingers and sending little gemstones dropping to the floor in a hard, accusatory patter. "Oh no!" Hard in his throat, Hanyu let the robe fall to the ground in an ill-guided move that sent more beads skipping free over the boards. He dropped to his hands and knees and began crawling desperately after the jewels while his head swam and his stomach clenched. "Oh no, oh no, oh no, oh no, oh!" His dizzy terror was interrupted and intensified when a furious voice snapped out from the door to the bedchamber. "Hanyu, what the fuck?" Lord Antony was back.